the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Tuesday, November 25th, 2014. Live from Ferguson, Bgyrl for Life, an activist who runs the site handsupdon'tshoot.com, joins us to discuss the fires that are raging on the streets and in communities nationwide as a grand jury decides not to indict Officer Darren Wilson on any charges. And many of us think that the state of Hawaii is occupied land, but just as the mainland U.S. is the product of settler colonialism and occupation, so too is the newest state in the Union. We'll speak with Native Hawaiian activist and filmmaker Keala Kelly. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Good morning, Sonali.
The U.S. and Iran, frustrated by a lack of progress on nuclear talks, have agreed to a 7-month extension, dashing hopes of an official warming of relations between the two nations. Secretary of State John Kerry met with Mohammed Javad Zarif in Oman, who is his counterpart, to discuss details of a deal that initially seemed tantalizingly close before they broke down into tense exchanges. Iranian speculation abounded as to why people were unable to conclude in an agreement. Republican congressional wins as well as Israel's influence could have played a role in an agreement not being reached. At stake would have been a freezing of Iran's nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of some sanctions. According to the New York Times, a U.S.-Iran deal was, quote, the foreign policy goal that could transform American relations with one of its most persistent adversaries and reshape the world's most volatile region. Courtney, how important are these talks?
Well, Sonali, I think these talks are hugely important. I mean, as you mentioned, these talks have implications not just for improving the relationship between the United States and Iran, but also in terms of transforming what is politically possible in the Middle East. And in the case of Iran, there's quite a lot at stake. The easing of Western sanctions, Western economic sanctions on Iran would be a huge boon to President Hassan Rouhani, who's losing quite a lot of political capital as the talks drag on, making it harder for him to ease in some of the democratic and secular reforms that he campaigned on during his presidential campaign in 2012. And in the United States, pushing through the agreement would have major implications in terms of dealing with the threat of ISIS in Iraq, containing the civil war in Syria. And so for many reasons, I think that these are some of the kind of the issues behind the scenes that are really at the heart of why these talks haven't fallen apart completely, because both sides perceive that there's really something more to be gained on top of the desired goal of ending the nuclear stalemate between the U.S. and Iran. But both sides are really going to have to work very hard in terms of dealing with the conservative hardliners on either side, Republicans in the U.S. who continue to threaten sanctions, additional sanctions, and the Islamic government in Iran who, for their own historical reasons, don't trust the United States. So it's a hugely important deal.
And in other international news, in Nigeria, between 45 and 60 people were killed this week when 2 suicide bombs blasted a crowded market in the northeastern city of Maiduguri. Unusually, the bombs are suspected to have been strapped to women. Maiduguri is considered a stronghold of the Nigerian militant organization Boko Haram, which took credit for kidnapping hundreds of young girls and women this summer. Boko Haram has been rapidly expanding its reach, taking over one town after another, even as government officials claim they are in negotiations with the group to sign a ceasefire agreement. The group's tactic is different from its usual approach of striking an area and retreating. More than 24 towns have been taken over by Boko Haram in recent weeks. Now, Courtney, international attention has really waned from Nigeria once the hubbub over the missing girls died down, at least in the media. But how serious is this crisis in Nigeria today?
Well, I think it's quite serious, particularly as we're seeing Boko Haram extend its power over parts of northeastern Nigeria and essentially establishing their own sort of quasi-insurgent state inside of the Nigerian state. And this is something that's very troubling because even though it's being couched in the language of a religious movement, and there's certainly some truth to those elements of it, it's in many ways Boko Haram's model of governance does not differ radically from that of the Nigerian government. It's the same level of corruption, of violence, and extortion of civilians that people are very used to in terms of their dealings with the Nigerian government. And this is a crisis that in many ways has been exacerbated by the West's ongoing support of the Nigerian government, despite its inefficiency and its corruption. So this is something we should all be very concerned about.
Right. And finally, in news that has consumed national and international media, a grand jury in St. Louis has declined to indict Darren Wilson of any charges in the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Protests have raged all evening and into the night in Ferguson and in cities around the country. Prosecuting attorney Robert McCulloch made a rambling speech last night as he justified the grand jury's decision. We'll have more on the story later in the program. But Courtney, I know that you, like many others, have been closely following this issue, and I really wanted to get your personal reaction to the news.
Well, you know, Sonali, I woke up this morning feeling just heavy with rage and sorrow. You know, I thought about being 10 years old and watching the Rodney King verdict in disbelief, and watching my parents looking at me and my brother completely helpless and having no sense of what to tell us. And I find myself feeling that same way. There are so many young Black children, young Black and brown children that I care about, and I feel that my arms aren't big enough to hold them, that we really can't protect them, that we live in a state of impunity where the police are allowed to take our lives with no consequences. And that sends the clear message that no matter what we tell our children, that at the end of the day, the state does not believe that Black lives matter. So it's a disheartening morning. I feel that in many ways we're all in mourning right now for the family of Mike Brown, for the family of all people who have lost loved ones to police abuse, and for this country, that we really, once again, the state has really failed to just do the right thing.
Well, Courtney, I want to thank you as always for your insight and your analysis and your heart. Thanks so much.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is our daily news flash guest expert. She is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll go live to Ferguson. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. In a rambling speech that indicted media coverage and protesters, but not the police officer who fatally shot Michael Brown, St. Louis County prosecuting attorney Robert McCulloch announced late yesterday that no charges would be filed. The grand jury was made up of 7 men and 5 women. Of them, 9 were white and 3 Black. At least 9 of the 12 needed to agree on an indictment for it to happen. Darren Wilson, who has resigned from the force, took time to get married last week. He's met with at least 5 TV anchors to decide who he can share his story with. Meanwhile, protesters who were gathered outside Ferguson Police Department last night, awaiting the grand jury decision, raged with anger and grief when it was announced that Wilson would face not even a single charge. More than 24 buildings and even some police cars were set alight. Fires burned all night and gunshots were heard. Police arrested more than 60 people. Across the country, solidarity marches were held. In Los Angeles, where this program is produced, protesters blocked the 110 freeway and attempted to block the 10. In Oakland, hundreds of people blocked the I-580 and many other streets. In New York, more than 1,000 people marched in Upper Manhattan, blocking bridges. In a few minutes, we'll go live to Ferguson to speak with an activist on the ground. But first, here is an excerpt of prosecuting attorney Robert McCulloch announcing the grand jury decision yesterday.
The law authorizes a law enforcement officer to use deadly force in certain situations. The law also allows all people to use deadly force to defend themselves in certain situations. So the grand jury considered whether Wilson was the initial aggressor in this case, or whether there was probable cause to believe that Darren Wilson was authorized as a law enforcement officer to use deadly force in this situation, or if he acted in self-defense. The duty of the grand jury is to separate fact from fiction. After a full and impartial and critical examination of all the evidence in the law, and decide if that evidence supported the filing of any criminal charges against Darren Wilson. They accepted and completed this monumental responsibility in a conscientious and expeditious manner. It is important to note here, and say again, that they are the only people who have heard and examined every witness and every piece of evidence. They discussed and debated the evidence among themselves before arriving at their collective decision. After their exhaustive review of the evidence, the grand jury deliberated over 2 days, making their final decision. They determined that no probable cause exists to file any charge against Officer Wilson and returned a no true bill on each of the 5 indictments. The physical and scientific evidence examined by the grand jury, combined with the witness statements supported and substantiated by that physical evidence, tells the accurate and tragic story of what happened.
And that is St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney Robert McCulloch speaking yesterday, a short excerpt from an almost 25-minute long speech. We now go live to Ferguson, Missouri to speak with an activist named Bgyrl for Life. She runs the website handsupdon'tshoot.com. She's been on the streets of Ferguson all summer and yesterday evening participating in the marches and demonstrations. She joins us on the phone. Welcome to Uprising, Bgyrl.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us what happened yesterday through your eyes as you've been out on the streets? What has the atmosphere been like? What are people feeling? What are you feeling this morning?
This morning I'm numb more so than anything. You got to understand this has been 100+ days for me.
Mm-hmm.
Could you hold 1 second, please? I'm back. It's been 100+ days. Draining, very draining, and it just seems like there will not be an end to this. Well, we were hoping yesterday to finally see some resemblance of justice. What we received was more of the same, which is just a complete lack of respect for our community and for Black and brown lives.
And had the grand jury yesterday decided in a way that might have made people more satisfied, it would have been a decision to indict. It wasn't a trial to convict. It would have been a decision to indict. And there would have, had that decision been made, there likely would have been a trial. And he probably still would have gotten off scot-free. But the fact that there hasn't even, essentially there was a decision made not to even have a trial. How do you respond to that?
Well, it was a decision not to even have a trial, not to even come forth with evidence, so that people could see the evidence, as it was being presented. The whole secret grand jury, a grand jury that makeup is very different from the population makeup of Ferguson, which is 80+% Black. And I think there were 3 Black jurors and 9 white jurors. So I don't even know how you could come up with those numbers.
And polls have shown that whites, largely, a majority of whites believe that the officer was innocent, whereas a majority of African Americans believed that he should at least stand trial. So right there, we see public polls showing a very sharp divide based on the race of people. Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, this was all for a trial. Okay, it was not conviction. It wasn't railroading him. It was allowing Darren Wilson to go through the same system that you or I would go through under similar circumstances.
What do you make of what Robert McCulloch said? First of all, it took them so long to come to a decision. Then a state of emergency declared a week before the decision made. Then a decision announced that the decision was made. And then many hours before that decision, which was made, announced, they kept pushing it back. And finally, his long speech where he spent a majority of time getting upset at social media and the news cycle and news outlets and protesters making judgments and speculations. What did you make of his approach, even just the manner in which this announcement was made?
I mean, it's been overkill and a strong arm approach from Jump Street, from day one, from the moment they let Michael Brown's body lay out for 4.5 hours. And everything that they've done up until this point has done nothing but reiterate that stance. It's been the only thing I can compare it to really is some type of psychological warfare. You know, you see dead bodies that lay out, you know, in the open. The prolonging of this entire process. He could have arrested Darren Wilson that first day. We didn't have to go through this. You know, none of us had to go through any of this, and they prolonged it. They selectively leaked information that was favorable to their take. What people have to understand is, like, with this grand jury, none of this evidence has been cross-examined. Okay, so it's just basically whatever taken at its word, you know, at face value, which you can't do. That's the reason we have trials.
Now, they have decided to release all of the documents of the evidence presented to the grand jury. In fact, those documents are now publicly available online this morning. It's, of course, probably too early for anyone to have had the chance to go through them. There's reams and reams of documents. But do you think that, given time, that legal experts might be able to look through these documents to determine what it was that the jury was told, what it was that was presented to them, to better dissect what their decision might have been based on?
No, because most legal experts, what they take away from this is how unusual this grand jury was conducted. The fact that the prosecutor just threw everything, just all the information out there, that they didn't press for a charge. All of these, this is not standard operating procedure. This was very calculated. Like I said, Robert McCullough had probable cause the first day. This evidence, like I said, it hasn't been subjected to cross-examination, and maybe perhaps, you know, in the upcoming days and months and possibly even years, you know, as legal scholars do look at this and they do vet, you know, this evidence, you know, and they dig, and it will be subject to cross-examination, you know, at that point in time, you know, we might see truth.
Bgyrl, what about Attorney General Eric Holder, who made a lengthy statement yesterday, as well released a statement, and reminded people that the federal investigation is still ongoing? Do you have any hope that a federal civil rights investigation might lead to some semblance of justice?
The federal investigation of George Zimmerman is still ongoing. So, I mean, we really can't say. We would hope that would be the case, but seeing that so many times that hasn't been the case, and in this case where there is obvious probable cause, you know what I'm saying? We shouldn't have even gotten to this point.
Now,
I just don't see how they're going to right this wrong.
The website 538.com analyzed some statistics of grand juries and found that when grand juries are convened to decide whether or not to charge someone, they almost always do charge them about 89% of the time, except in cases of police officer-involved shootings, in which case that percentage drops precipitously. And I'm wondering, did anyone really believe that Wilson would be charged? I mean, didn't people know deep down inside that as a police officer, the likelihood of him being charged, and then if he was charged, to be tried and found guilty, is almost zero? I mean, that's the world we live in today, and isn't that why people are so angry? Even, you know,
that's why people are so angry. The fact that they put us through this dog and pony show, when they could have just said the first day that they were not going to do anything. They've wasted a lot of time, energy, resources. You know, at the end of the day, and we're still pretty much where we were. We're a lot worse right now than we were on August the 9th.
Why?
You know, on August the 9th, we had hope. We have no hope today.
What do you make of the fact that there were solidarity protests held around the country? People risked arrest. Several did get arrested outside of Ferguson, New York, Los Angeles, Oakland, Phoenix, many cities around the country. There has been a deep solidarity. Has that been heartening for you?
Yes, because it shows us that, you know, it's not just us. It's not just Ferguson. This is a national epidemic. It has to stop. I think since Michael Brown was killed here, at least 4 or 5 people have died at the hands of the police here in St. Louis. Whether it's been police shootings or in jails.
So at this point, with the activism that has emerged from Ferguson and flourished, people like yourself and many, many others who've been very organized, who've taken to not just social media, started their own websites. What is the next step? I mean, you said earlier that there is no hope this morning, but you're not all just packing your bags and going home. This is where you live. This is the reality on the ground. What are you going to do next?
We're going to do what we have continued to do since August 9th. The only thing that has changed really in our eyes is the fact that they've been honest about, the fact that they're not going to charge Darren Wilson. Other than that, nothing else has changed. And we look at it, you have police policing themselves, essentially, using the prosecutor, using, the grand jury. These are all types of abuses of power. I mean, things have to change. And if this is what it takes, then this is what it takes. I don't advocate violence. I don't advocate destruction of property. But as Martin Luther King Jr. said, riot is the language of the unheard. The question is, can they hear us now?
Now, Darren Wilson took the time to get married last week. He's been courting TV anchors about who to tell his story to. He seemed confident, at least from the little that we could see of him, that he was going to get away with this.
Yes, he testified in front of the grand jury. That is never done unless a defendant knows that he's not going to be indicted.
And of course, Michael Brown wasn't there to speak for himself. Was Michael Brown's family allowed to testify?
There were witnesses who were allowed to testify. I'm not sure if his family was. I'm pretty certain they probably were. The problem is it's the way that they testified. Like I said before, none of this has been subject to cross-examination. So without, that, how can you get to the truth? You can't get to the truth. All you have is a story. That's it.
What do you make of the media coverage at large? And I don't just mean independent media, mainstream media as well. And I'm wondering if you think that by extending the decision, delaying the decision for so long with the eyes of the media on Ferguson, that it actually gave an opportunity for mainstream media outlets to do some in-depth coverage of the movement in Ferguson. Do you feel overall the media coverage has shone a responsible spotlight on this issue?
No, I feel like they've sensationalized it. I feel like there are a lot of stories and subplots that they could have paid more attention to, and had they done that, we wouldn't be where we are today.
What coverage would you have preferred them to do? What should they have focused on?
More into Darren Wilson's past with the Jennings Police Department, which is where he started his career. The Jennings Police Department was dismantled for racism and corruption. All of the police officers were fired. How did that make him a qualified candidate for the Ferguson Police Department? Questionable ties that he and his now wife have to the Klan. Robert McCullough, his background, he's from a police family. His father was a police officer that was killed by a black suspect. The fact that he's been in office over 20 years and he's never, ever, ever indicted, let alone charged, a police officer with killing an unarmed citizen. I can go on and on. Right. The disparities here, just in the court system and how justice is rendered. I'll give you a prime example. They arrested 2 new Black Panthers, they say, for purchasing guns illegally. They went to a reputable gun dealership and purchased guns, and they're saying that they were giving the guns to someone else. This happened last week. They indicted them. They're already indicted, okay?
Wow.
It didn't take all this time.
And this is just for purchasing guns and not for actually shooting them or killing anybody.
Not shooting anyone or killing anyone. Exactly. Also, when you look at the protests and things that are going on right now, Just look at the video. You don't see police dodging bullets. Chief Belmar spoke a lot about shots being fired. I didn't hear any shots. And in none of the videos that you see will you hear shots. And you won't see police dodging bullets. And you don't see police stopping looters. You don't see fire people putting out fires. What you see is a strong militarized response to peaceful protesters. That's what you see.
Finally, you have and others have turned to social media tremendously to get the word out about what's happening in Ferguson. But I understand that you found even social media sites like Facebook have attempted to shut you down. This is another story I think the media missed.
Well, it goes along with Facebook's name policy. They have a policy where you can use the name that you use in life. It doesn't necessarily have to be your real name. For example, authors have pseudonyms, entertainers have stage names. I write and I work under the name Bgyrl for Life, and I've been doing that for over 20 years. This happened to me, and several other people in the movement. The closer we got to the announcement, now all of a sudden Facebook wants, our names, legal names. Legal identification, and it's unsettling because you have Klan members making threats against people. You have police officers. There was a website called Cop Talk, where St. Louis police officers gathered and they talked online about protesters and what they wanted to do. As a matter of fact, one of the things they spoke about was one of the safe houses, which was a coffee shop last night, which is where I was at. And shortly after we left, they were tear gassed. So they're putting people's lives, at risk. And they just had this big situation with drag queens where they said that they would relax the policy for drag queens, people in the gay and lesbian community, because of danger, and biases and prejudices that people may have against them and want to hurt them. And I'm just saying, don't protesters and activists and whistleblowers deserve the same.
Well, Bgyrl is the best place for our listeners and viewers to find out what's happening. The website that you helped to run, handsupdon'tshoot.com?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Well, we will post that to our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. I want to wish you the best of luck and thank you so much for joining us. I know you've likely been up all night. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
My guest is Bgyrl for Life. That's the name she goes by. She's an activist based in Ferguson, Missouri. She lives there and she runs the website handsupdon'tshoot.com. And we will be bringing you more coverage of the aftermath of the decision to not indict Darren Wilson on any charges for the shooting death of Michael Brown in the coming weeks. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll turn to the occupation of Hawaii and how activists there are fighting for sovereignty. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. This week on Uprising, as we head into the Thanksgiving holiday, we'll focus on Indigenous communities in the U.S. Tomorrow on the program, we'll have an hour-long conversation with activist and author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz about her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Today, we focus on another Indigenous community that is rarely considered to be part of the settler colonialist founding of the United States, and that is Hawaii's Indigenous population. Hawaii was made the 50th of the United States of America in August 1959. The story of statehood is one of overthrow, occupation, cultural erasure, and militarism. Amidst that, a vibrant struggle for Hawaiian sovereignty has emerged. Joining me now to explore that struggle is Anne Keala Kelly, a Native Hawaiian activist and documentary filmmaker of the film Noho Hewa, The Wrongful Occupation of Hawaii. She contributed an essay to a new anthology recently called A Nation Rising, Hawaiian Movements for Life, Land, and Sovereignty. Welcome to Uprising, Keala.
Hey, good morning. Aloha.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Well, first, let's talk about Hawaii's Native population. We don't hear nearly enough about Hawaii's indigenous communities, particularly people who live away from the West Coast. Tell us how big is Hawaii's Native population? What are the sort of cultural indicators that mark this population?
Okay, great question. And I do think people hear a lot about Hawaiians. I think what they hear are lies. They hear tourism industry fiction about the Hawaiian people. There are about 500,000 of us who are identified as Hawaiian. It's a genealogical identity. It is not based on blood quantum or phenotypical characteristics. About half of our population lives in the diaspora, mostly along the West Coast.
And so how do people identify today within Hawaii as a people in terms of seeing the founding of the United States, in terms of seeing their islands occupied, their land occupied? Do Native Hawaiians essentially see themselves as a colonized people?
Another good question. We're dealing with a settler colonial reality in Hawaii, but we're also dealing with an occupation because we have this history as a nation state. We have this history of being the Hawaiian Kingdom, which was recognized in 1842. So for us, it's a really complicated path that we're on right now because the indigenous movement internationally is profound.
Yeah.
And our connection to our friends here on the continent and our cousins in the Pacific is also profound. So we're having to look at both issues simultaneously.
And so what are some similarities that you see, at least socially, in terms of the social indicators between the U.S.'s mainland indigenous communities and Hawaii's population, aside, of course, from the similar history of having lost their lands to settler colonialism? Do Native Hawaiians today suffer from similar social problems as mainland indigenous communities do in terms of poverty, homelessness, unemployment, et cetera?
Well, I think there's a tendency, first of all, there's a resistance. There's constant resistance. I know they have resistance movements here on the continent. I can speak to the Hawaiian movement. We have had nonstop resistance to the theft of our lands. And that resistance is as powerful today as it ever was, but it's never covered in the media. It's completely marginalized. Yes, I think in a white supremacist country and a white supremacist society, there are similarities between what's done to, say, the Lakota and what is done to the Kanaka Maoli. Yes, they're similar, but they're different because the people on the continent have been forced into reservations, whereas we're faced right now with an attempt to federally recognize us through President Obama's administration. So there are similarities in terms of theft and erasure, but our histories are also very, very different.
And I want to get to that the attempt for federal recognition briefly. But if you can summarize for our listeners, I know that of course history is complex and there are so many nuances. But how do you tell the story in a nutshell of how the Hawaiian Kingdom was overthrown, and we don't and we don't often realize that it was a kingdom that was established and in place, and it was literally overthrown.
Right. There's actually Iolani Palace isn't just for tourists. That's an actual palace, and it was illegally overthrown by the United States government in 1893, and then 5 years later, after much political maneuvering, the United States passed what's referred to as a fake treaty of annexation because there was never a treaty of annexation. So they took they took control of Hawaii in 1898, and it's been a military occupation ever since. And that has allowed them to expand their empire continually, right up until now, throughout the Pacific, into Africa, in their effort to control Asia. This has been going on for over a century. So for us, we're an occupied country. It's a different occupation than what we see happening in Palestine, of course, which is a horror in and of itself. What's happening to the Hawaiians is a different kind of erasure that isn't as bloody, but it's as complete as what's being done to people in Palestine.
So let's talk about militarism, and we should remind our listeners Hawaii, of course, sits essentially like in the middle of the Pacific. I mean, it's very far off from the mainland.
It's the most remote.
It sits in the middle of the
Right.
middle of the largest body of water on
Correct.
Earth, essentially halfway to Japan. And so that's a very strategic outpost for the United States. How militarized is Hawaii? I saw a statistic where about 1% of the U.S. mainland's population is military. In Hawaii, that statistic is 11% of the residents are essentially members of the military.
At least, and another thing to understand about that is when they come there, sometimes they stay, they retire. So we don't just have active duty military, we have retired military. We have generations of them. So here we are, just over 20% of the population
This is the Native Hawaiian
is
population.
us, yes, the Native Hawaiians. And then everybody else is there, and a lot of those people who are there are military. And also, we don't have an accurate count necessarily as to how many military live there, how many active military personnel are there. In fact, after September 11th, the influx of military was off the charts. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that number was a little bit larger. That's what I'm saying.
And so this is essentially a training ground for troops who go to Iraq, Afghanistan, and film Noho Hewa. You have a very interesting connection that you make between troops who train in Hawaii, which is considered an occupied land, and troops who went off to that other occupation, the occupation of Iraq. And essentially engaged in combat that resulted in Iraqis killed. Why was that connection important to make?
Because we're human. Because it was happening in a valley called Makua Valley in that particular part of the film. And Makua means parents. And I connected the training of these soldiers to the one event. There were countless thousands of events of women and children being gunned down in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. But I connected it to that particular event because the name of that valley is Makua Valley. It means parents, and it's been desecrated. It's being massacred, basically. It's a murdered valley, and used for training people on how to murder. And so I connected it to that one woman's story where she was shot down when she was farming with her daughters. And the reason she was gunned down was because she was running away after there'd been a roadside bomb. So it's a small thing, but I'd hope that people, when they see it in the film, that they connect it to the thousands of stories like hers.
Right. And so the militarism in Hawaii today, how much resistance is there to the, not just the presence of the military, but the active research and training? You mentioned Makua Valley. I mean, they're essentially using that as a training facility, but they're also testing weapons, right? I mean, they're testing weapons on the land that people are living on.
Well, they don't tell you much of anything. In fact, let me just say about Makua Valley, that's like where some of the least training is going on. We have at least 25% of the island of Oahu is completely controlled by the military. It is the largest military command on Earth is on Oahu, and that's not counting the air and that's not counting the ocean. Right. So we have Pohakuloa training area on Hawaii Island, which is the largest live fire training area outside of the United States. So the military is everywhere. It's on our summits, it's on Mauna Kea, it's on Haleakala, it's everywhere. We are inundated with military. So for instance, just about 5 or 6 years ago, the Army admitted to having dumped thousands and thousands of tons of chemical weapons, chemicals, off of the coast of Waianae near Makua. Waianae Coast is where a huge population of Hawaiians lives. One of the largest populations of Hawaiians is located on Waianae Coast. And the illnesses that they suffer, not just because of poverty, but because of who knows what else, because they are inundated with military installations out there. There's no studies done on that. The rates of cancer. So it's hard to track. It's actually quite hard to track all of these things because there are very few studies being done, and we don't get to know. They don't tell us. ahead of time that, oh, they lied about using uranium, and we find out years later they used uranium.
And I
at
understand it was
Mokulua.
also a testing ground for Agent Orange historically. Yeah.
They developed Agent Orange in Hawaii through the University of Hawaii.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the University of Hawaii system as well. But let's go back to some of the issues that Native Hawaiians, today, given you said 20% of the population is Native Hawaiian. Where does that population live on the social strata of Hawaii? Because, movie stars have second homes there, politicians, as you said, retired military. Hawaii is beautiful all year round. It's a place that people consider sort of a luxury destination, but its native population has a large percentage of people simply living homeless.
Well, that's because it's a small place, and people think it's so harmless for them to come over there for a vacation, or I just want one small home. Well, for every one of them, how many of us have to leave? They take the resources of the water and the land. They take everything. They take the most beautiful beaches because they want their vacation homes there. But most of those beaches have burial grounds on them. So the mass desecration of Hawaiian sacred sites and burials is ongoing, constant. It's constant. And it's the wealthy people who want their homes. It's the vacation resorts that people want to, have their fantasy vacations. So what they don't understand is this built-up environment that's been created for them means that we can't actually be Hawaiians in Hawaii. That's why our diaspora is 50%.
Wow. So I want to focus briefly on the essay that you wrote for this anthology, A Nation Rising, Hawaiian Movements for Lifeland and Sovereignty. And in this essay, you have a moving portrait of these two women named Marie Beltran and Annie Pau. And you start out saying, homeless at home, Marie Beltran and Annie Pau assert their rights to ea under the direst circumstances. I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, but tell us about the word. It's EA, the letters EA. What does this word mean? Why is it important? And who these two women are?
That's a great question, and I'm going to circle back to your question that I didn't quite answer a moment ago. It means sovereignty. It means to be sovereign.
And it's ea?
Ea, yeah, that's the Hawaiian word. So Annie Pau and Marie Beltran, that's stories about these two women who, for years, lived homeless, or what we call houseless. And Annie was on the Waianae coast. And she was one of, at the time, and it's still like this out there, at the time that I wrote that, or when I was filming, she was living out there, and she was one of about 3,000, it's like a refugee camp out there, that stretches along about 11 miles of coast. Beautiful coastline, but just thousands of homeless people, and most of them, easily 70% of the homeless people in Hawaii are Hawaiian, easily 70%. So think about it, if we're making up 20% of the population, but 70% of the homeless, 50, 60, and 70% of the incarcerated for men, women, and children.
Wow.
And the ones that are dying from the diseases, we have the highest rates of suicide. I mean, we have the worst, again, like our native cousins up here on the continent, we have the worst socioeconomic indicators. Nobody would want to be Hawaiian. People have fantasies about Hawaiians, but, well, are they going to have, does that fantasy include high rates of diabetes, right? So we have all of these physical, spiritual, cultural ills that come from the occupation, that come from people from the United States or people from California thinking it's okay to just go over there with their retirement money and buy one or two homes because they can, get two houses for the price of one, basically. And then they ruin the real estate market so that regular Hawaiians can't afford to live. I mean, and I mentioned this in that essay, the reason that Annie Pau and her husband John became homeless was a direct result of the influx of military personnel after September 11th, because the U.S. military came in and they completely took over the real estate market, because they sent in thousands of people to be trained in Hawaii, but they had no housing for them. So rather than create housing for them, they gave them stipends of up to $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 a month. So apartments that used to be like $700 a month were suddenly $1,400 a month overnight.
And so people were priced out.
Completely
Like their
priced out.
own
So
homes.
Annie and her husband were a perfect example of people who one day they were living just barely getting by, and the next day they were 2 blocks away from where they used to live, living on the beach, and they stayed there. They ended up living, they kept having to move because they sweep them out. So that's actually how military, tourism, real estate, all of those industries come together, and it's very seamless. It's invisible to the naked eye. People don't see, they just look and they say, oh, look at all these Hawaiians, and they think they're lazy, or they think they're just stupid. And what they're what's being done to us is we're being choked out and squeezed out of our homeland by these industries and by American culture and by the occupation.
I want to talk about the attempt to federally recognize Native Hawaiians as an indigenous community, similar to how American Indians on the mainland have been recognized. Former Hawaiian Senator Daniela Kaka sponsored a bill, and that bill was revived in Congress earlier this year. What would this bill do, and why are Hawaiians against it?
Well, I think there have been attempts to revive the bill. At the same time, what's happened now is it's sort of switched over to this President Obama's desire to use his executive order
action,
to create the same
because it's
process,
not making its way through
because
Congress.
it can't get through Congress. And what that essentially is like a fake recognition, because again, it's a cover-up of the occupation. We are not a native people of the United States. The United States came over and took over. We're not part of the United States. We're occupied, number one. And number two, it's really only some Hawaiians that will be recognized. It is, there have been a series of these roles, one of them called Kana'aiolowalu, the most recent one. And that's the one, for some reason, President Obama is very fond of that role.
So it's a registry.
A registry
of a few hundred, I understand, just over 100,000.
But it's not even that many,
Not
actually,
even?
because some of the people on that list are dead, so it's actually a fraudulent list. It's been an incredibly corrupt process. Millions and millions and millions of dollars have gone into these attempts to do what we're talking about here. Most Hawaiians won't touch it. They won't sign the roll. It's like the Dawes Act, they don't want to be a part of this because they know it's a fraud. But the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which is a state agency, has tried several times to create the appearance that Hawaiians want to be federally recognized. And the Obama administration is very happy to go along with that because they all want what will come as a result of that, which will be military contracts. It'll be Hawaiians being able to get federal contracts, just like the Alaska Natives are able to get, easier access to federal money. But that doesn't help most Hawaiians. That's just a handful of groups that will be able to profit from that.
And so the federal recognition, it would be the sort of nail in the coffin of colonialism, that's the sort of end of the process. That's it. Now the occupation is history.
That's what they are attempting to do. And because we're so marginalized, our media our stories never get reported, and it's so difficult to get these stories out. Most people are completely unaware of the resistance of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement.
So in addition to the military-industrial complex, in addition to the tourist industry, there's another interesting industry in Hawaii that Hawaiians have been fighting against, and that is the sort of academic industrial complex, represented in part by the University of Hawaii, but also I want to bring up the astronomy industry in Hawaii, which is an interesting sort of personal issue for me. I was a graduate student at the University of Hawaii many years ago at the Institute for Astronomy, and this is before I was a journalist, before I understood politics, and I remember watching with astonishment this debate on the UH campus between one of the heads of our department, and I can't remember what his name was, and one of the Trask sisters, Mililani and Haunani Trask, who are these amazing, fierce women, and the two of them were debating one another about the use of Mauna Kea, which is one of the two mountains which are considered very sacred on the big island, Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is essentially, the top of it has been now covered with these giant telescopes that international collaborators and other countries' governments have essentially leased the land to have these telescopes, including UH. Why is that important, or how symbolically important is that fight to reclaim Mauna Kea for Hawaiians?
It is profoundly important and timely, also because of this federal recognition issue, because the so-called state of Hawaii does not have title to that land. There was never a treaty of annexation, so the title to the Crown and government lands of the Hawaiian Kingdom was never transferred. So it's like an illegal leasing taking place. It is one of the most sacred mountains in Polynesia. It's the tallest mountain in Polynesia. So the telescopes that are already up there are in the front. This particular telescope we're talking about now, though, is called the TMT, the 30-meter telescope. It's a $1.5 billion project that they're attempting to build up there. It is the size of a football stadium.
Yeah.
And is 19 stories high.
And astronomers like it because it's above the
clouds
and it gives clear access, etc.
Right.
But
it is actually one of the most sacred. It
Yeah.
certainly is one of the most sacred sites in Hawaii and in Polynesia. So in addition to that, though, like most places in Hawaii, the ecosystem is very fragile, and the freshwater aquifer for most of the island of Hawaii is on Mauna Kea. These telescopes and the astronomy industry is not a clean industry. Countless chemicals are used for those telescopes, and they've had mercury spills there. They've had multiple issues up there. It's a really dangerous thing to have those kinds of poisons near your freshwater aquifer.
Yeah. Not to mention people going tramping through these sacred grounds in the pursuit of science, but not really paying attention to the real values and cultural beliefs of people.
If they can't take care of the planet they're on, they have no business looking at other planets. And that industry is rife with a kind of obsession with looking at outer space, but not caring what you're doing to the Earth, the planet that you're actually on. It's a kind of complete disconnect. It's kind of pathological.
You just captured into words exactly the reason why I left astronomy. Let's talk about the rest of Hawaii's population. You mentioned 20% is Native Hawaiian. There is an interesting sort of a different racial makeup of the residents of Hawaii than we have on the mainland. Asians are a plurality. About 40% of the population is mostly Japanese, Filipinos, and other Asian Americans. Whites are about 24%. What are relations like between these various racial groups in Hawaii? Is there common cause between the Asian community and the Hawaiian community, or do these two groups consider themselves quite distinct with different interests?
Completely different. The Hawaiians.
Certainly ethnically and racially, they're different.
We're indigenous, but our connection to the place is different. We have a genealogical.
Right. So it's not just being a minority.
They're immigrants, so they have a kind of more of an American idea about themselves. They're there to be Americans, and that's not to say that we don't have Asian allies. We do, and we also have haole people who are our allies as well, white people. So, but they're. The majority of the settlers there, they are not connected at all to the Hawaiian cause. They will use portions of Hawaiian culture, like the Aloha spirit, those kinds of tourism industry slogans, to they'll Hawaiianize certain parts of their lives because it's convenient and that's where they are. But most of them, no, they are not in solidarity with us. And they're part of the problem, actually, because they're not in solidarity with us. Listen, 90% of everything that's consumed in Hawaii is imported from the continent. Think about that. We are completely dependent. They have created a situation where everybody living there is completely dependent for everything that we eat, everything that we wear. The people who live there, whether they care about Hawaiians or they care about the environment, they should at least care about themselves, being that dependent from something from 2,400 miles away.
And so speaking of the environment, Hawaii, in particular Maui County, was the site recently of a very interesting battle that took place during the midterm elections. The other industry, which we haven't gotten to yet, is the agricultural industry. We, equate Dole pineapples with Hawaii, and companies like Monsanto, and a lot of people I think didn't know this till the ballot measure in November got people's attention that GMO crops, that Hawaii has been used as a testing ground for GMO crops. And the people of Maui County said no. They voted in a majority to to ban the testing of GMO crops. How important a victory was that, and how has the industry fought back?
It's a huge victory, and also the people on the island of Kauai have been real leaders in the fight against the GMO industry. I want to say people there have been getting sick from the chemicals that are being used there. That's something that often gets left out. The evidence...
Because GMOs go hand in hand with heavy pesticide use.
Absolutely. The chemicals that are sprayed are out. It's just an outrage. So on Molokai, Kauai, Maui, there's been a lot of resistance. What happened on Maui with this election was about the most interesting thing that happened in the entire election. But the industry fought back and is actually suing them. Monsanto is suing them because they're saying it's illegal for you to tell us that we can't come in and do what we want to do. And that's how the industry works. That's another thing that, I would hope that your audience takes away from this, is that the largest concentration of open field GMO test sites in the world is in Hawaii, this tiny place. So along with the largest military command, we have the largest concentration of these test grounds. We also have the largest concentration of endangered species habitats per square mile. It's a very, very fragile place. It's a sacrifice zone for the United States. It's a sacrifice zone for these industries. They don't care what happens to the people who live there. They don't care if they're destroying the land. and they don't mind stealing the water from us so that we can actually grow food that we can eat. Like I said, we're 90% food dependent. Before settlers came to Hawaii, 1 million Hawaiians lived there before Captain Cook showed up and brought all the diseases and everything that followed. And those people, they didn't use anything except the land.
Yeah. Finally, Keala, what is the vision for sovereignty like that activists like yourself have, and what's the common cause that you see with this growing international awareness and organizing that Indigenous communities worldwide are now taking on? They're going to the UN, etc.
Again, our path is slightly different.
Yeah.
Because we are an Indigenous people, and we do have our presence there at the Permanent Forum and working internationally with Indigenous peoples. People like Millie Lenny Trask.
Yeah.
She's right out there. She's a leader internationally on that. We also have our independence movement, which is a movement for deoccupying Hawaii. We want the United States to deoccupy. We want to demilitarize and deoccupy. And we do want to be reinstated and have our country back. So it's both of these things happening simultaneously, almost competing with each other. It's complicated and fascinating at the same time.
Where can listeners find out more about your work, the film Nohohewa, and the book that your work is going to be published in? Is there a website?
Well, they can go to nohohewa.com, nohohewa.com for information about the film. Also, I want to suggest that people look into the Mauna Kea issue. They can go to sacredmaunakea.wordpress, .blogspot, I forget, .wordpress.blogspot, sacredmaunakea@gmail.com. Just send an email.
Or people can Google it as
Correct,
well.
correct.
I want to thank you so much, Keala Kelly, for joining us
What
today.
a
Best of
pleasure.
luck to you.
Mahalo nui, it's an honor.
Thank you. Keala Kelly is my guest. She is a filmmaker, a documentarian, and a Hawaiian rights activist. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer and our program director. Jennifer McMartin is our research intern. Camilo Ramirez and Christian Beck are our production interns. Annie Mendoza is our media intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel right now at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you soon.